Today I will be presenting a paper entitled Two Decades of Mitigating Re-Representation. I'll be looking at how Rwanda has actually come out of the genocide of 1994 and actually reposition itself as one of the developing country on the African continent, and looking at the recent corruption index and the doing business index. Rwanda ranks second, and one of the issues which a lot of people trying to answer or trying to interrogate is how come that a country 20 years ago was actually at the abyss, and right now it's actually at the top with regards to developmental projects on the continent. So those are some of the issues that actually interest me, and I decided, with the help of the Research and Publication Committee of the African Institute, to actually undertake a field trip. And this field trip was undertaken sometime last month. I spent about 21 days in Rwanda, and I had a very interesting period in Rwanda, visiting the various provinces, the four provinces of Rwanda, interacting with interesting people, expanding my knowledge on what I actually understand, was the causes of the Rwandan genocide. And the main issue with regards to this particular discussion was the issue of re-representation. How do we, a country that has actually come out of a conflict situation like what Rwanda went through, how do we try to re-represent its society? I know South Africa is also struggling in that regard, but I think this is actually a first part of a bigger research project that I intend to undertake, looking at a comparative study with what happened in Rwanda and the situation in South Africa. I think next year I'll probably be expanding on this particular project to look at how South Africa is actually re-representing itself 20 years after the democratic transition in 1994. The second part is looking at post-conflict reconstruction. What do I mean by that? I think the emphasis here is on rebuilding institutions, rebuilding, the various institutions in Rwanda that can actually protect human rights, protect democracy. The talk has been all over the media about building institutions. I think that is the focus in which this particular aspect of reconstruction actually talked about. The structure, I'll try to look at the problematic of Rwandan society. I look at the characterization of the history, especially the pre-colonial, colonial, and the post-colonial area. I look at the change in colonial policy orientation. I also try to interrogate some of the reasons why the policies were changed immediately before independence. I'll look at the post-colonial policy re-representation, which is what I mentioned here as being some of the causes of the genocide. I'll try to look at the model which the Rwanda government is actually employing now to actually reconstruct its society, which is what they actually call Rwanda. And I'll also look at the challenges of this particular model. My trip to Rwanda took me to principally these areas. I was in Rengeri, which is now called Musanze. There I met with the chairperson of the National Unity and Reconciliation Committee, Bishop John, which is on the far right. I also visited the Habyarimana residence in Kigali, which is now a museum, where people are actually being, when you visit that particular museum, you are being taught about the history of post-colonial Rwanda. I had group discussions in Bogosuri. I also met Bishop Antoine in Kibungu, trying to look at the role of the church during the genocide. Because in this particular diocese, there were about 6 or 7 priests that were killed. I also had some group discussions in Butari. Butari was around where the Save Church is situated where about 5,000 people were also killed in that particular, in that particular area. I also visited Nyanza. Nyanza is the royal capital of Rwanda. The former royal capital, which is most of the houses in this particular area have been turned into museums. So I also visited some of those museums in that area. I also visited genocide memorials. In Rwanda, I think the space was very small for me to put most of the pictures with regards to the memorials. To start with. Just to be very clear, most of the pictures that I put here, the people were very okay with me putting their pictures. Those that were not very comfortable, their pictures are not put. Their pictures are not being represented here. One of the main issues or the main proverb that most Rwandese, when I talk to them, they will actually say, "A hero on the battlefield has a wound on the palm of his hand." And the issue here, right here, the interpretation is that the Rwandese people are very hardworking people. They are, most of the issues they do, they want to see to it that it actually come to fruition, and that most of what they also plan to do, they actually take it right to the end, which is, which talked about the issue of a wound in the palm of your hand, which is evidence based that what I've actually put myself to do, I'll actually do it to the end. So most of the discussions, most of the people that you talk to, they'll actually talk about this particular proverb. By way of introduction, I argue here that immediately after 1990, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the bipolar war as well, the effects were actually felt all over the world. But Africa, the effects were very much particularly felt on the continent, in the sense that most of the problems that Africa actually inherited from the post-colonial area were actually lay dormant within the system, the post-colonial system. And after the liberalization of the political space in the 1990s, most of these issues were now exposed into they were now exposed, the issues of the national question, especially resource control, the issue of ethnicity, and so on. Some of those issues were actually exposed into the public arena. And, and in Africa, most importantly, the issue of conflict became, a major concern. One day there was an emergence, or not really emergence, but there was issues of asymmetric conflict as opposed to the conventional nature of conflict. There were also issues of conflict were more within state as against another state. So those are issues which became very apparent during this particular period. And the one I also noticed that during this period there were two important issues that happened. The first was the Rwandan genocide as a result of this opening of the political space. First was the Rwandan genocide and the democratic transition in South Africa. The Rwandan genocide was actually not really an eye opener, but per se, but it actually lay bare some of the major fractures or some of the major challenges within African nation building framework, especially with the post 1960 infrastructure. The question now many people started asking was African countries really prepared for independence? And it actually brought me to the question, to some of the discussion I was having in Rwanda, where most of the people were saying that, the Tutsis, the Hutus were saying that in the 1960s, that Rwanda was not yet ripe for independence, that Rwanda still need another 50 years in order for the political elite to actually mature in terms of nation building management before Belgium can actually hand over this particular colony to the people. But as it all happened, the Tutsis, were actually insisting on immediate independence, and I will actually discuss on some of the reasons why the Tutsis were insisting on independence at this particular period. And the period, the 1990s, as I also indicated in the last point, there is, actually lay bare some of the issues, the questions where people start asking. was the role of the OAU in terms of guaranteeing collective security on the continent. Was the OAU actually structured, in such a way that it can actually, guarantee the security of the people on the continent? And I think it is based on this particular argument that, that the OAU was actually transformed, in the early part of 2000 to actually look at, to actually address some of these concerns that the post 1990 era actually presented on the continent. Again, one of the issues which I also want to actually discuss here is the dynamics in Rwandan's history. One of the issues which I came across in my research in Rwanda is the fact that Rwanda is just one of a few countries on the continent that colonial powers did not actually fire a shot, in order to acquire it. There was no fight over Rwanda. The Germans actually were handed over this particular territory, during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. And for over 10 years, the Germans didn't actually know where Rwanda was situated on the continent. They really didn't, they could only send expeditions, to this part of the country. And it was actually in 1895 that the first German national, Gustav von Gosten, actually met King Rabugiri. And King Rabugiri was so traumatized by the fact that when he was told that, the Germans were now in charge of Rwanda, that he actually, didn't recover from that particular meeting with von Gosten, and he died some few months later. The Germans also, when the Germans arrived, they also noted that that though the people spoke the same language, they were physically different. The tall ones, which made up of about 14% of the population, were called the Tutsis. Those with typical Bantu features were referred to as the Hutu, and the chunky, muscular ones were categorized as the Twa. And these later on became the some of the main characteristics which the post-colonial state actually inherited. And from this representation, you will actually see that that the Tutsis were actually recognized or actually seen as colonizers of the territory Rwanda, because Rwanda was not. They look at the Tutsis from their physical appearance as not really being African. So they were looked upon as being the Hemite colonizers. They were looked upon as headsmen. They were warriors. They were tall, elegant. They were light-skinned. They had a refined sense of judgment, and above all, the colonialists said they were born to rule. That the Tutsis were born to rule. The Hutus, on the other hand, were looked upon or were categorized as cultivators. They had a big head, they had a jovial expressions, enormous lips with a white nose. They were extroverts. They liked to laugh, and they lived a very simple life. The Twa, on the other hand, were court jesters. They were porters. They were chunky, muscular, and very hairy. They were short and stunted. They were hunters. They had a very wide, huge nose, dark skin, monkey-like face. They were actually laborers in the Tutsi households, and they were also looked upon as slaves. And they constituted just about 1% of the population of Rwanda at that time. And I argue in this next slide that Rwandan history was not like this. Rwandan history was not actually, though the Rwandan society was actually not categorized in this way. And I put here that according to a popular legend, which a lot of Rwandese from both sides of the ethnic divide, Tutsis, Hutus and the Twas, they said, the Tutsi Twas and were descendants of one person, which they all call the Gihanga. That Gihanga had actually three sons, and the entire population in Rwanda was a descendants of these three people. So if they are all descendants of one particular person, then there's no way they can be defined as coming from different ethnic groups. But I think this is something that one needs to interrogate going further, because looking at the way in which the Tutsis are, it is but obvious that they probably are not from that particular part of the continent. I also argue here that the ethnic nomenclature, the Hutu, Tutsi, were not necessarily tied to specific economic functions, as I earlier mentioned in the previous slide. They were actually social and economic. The people could actually move from being a Tutsi to a Hutu, and from being a Hutu to a Tutsi. What do I mean by this? If you could, in the course of your daily activities, you could acquire, more than 10 cows, which was a threshold for being a Hutu or a Tutsi, you automatically become a Tutsi. And if you are a Tutsi and it happens that something happened, or maybe drought happened, and then your cattle are being eaten, or maybe eaten by wild animals, you automatically become a Hutu. So there was, in pre-colonial Rwanda, there was this economic, mobility between the various groups, which, most of them, most of the people I interviewed in Rwanda, they call it the social groups in Rwanda. So they were not really ethnic groups, they were social groups. So you could move between the two. But it was difficult to become a Twa, or to move from a Twa to a Hutu, because the difference was so obvious. But I also argue here that that the Rwandese history, that the Rwandans are people of integrity. Each time when you talk to them, they said, we never participated in the transatlantic slave trade. And the reason, one of the reasons, one person will ask, but why the reason? Why do you think we never participated in the transatlantic slave trade? I will usually say, no, it's probably because, Rwanda is situated about 2,000 meters above sea level. I will say probably that's the reason. They said, no. The reason is because the Rwandese king was very much intelligent. He intelligent in the sense that he didn't want to treat any of his subjects to outside people, because the idea was that especially in Africa, was that it was Africans that actually were giving their own kids, their brothers and sisters to slavery. But the Rwandese, the king was very strict on that. There was no way a Rwandese will be sold or be sent to slavery, and it was a law which up to the 1960s was still very much being respected. Even if you go to Rwanda, it becomes even very difficult for even Rwandese themselves to even save in houses like maids. If most of the maids in Rwanda are probably from neighboring countries, they don't look at themselves as being maids in order to work for somebody. And I also argue here that this concept of Umu Rwanda, it's a concept which pre-colonial Rwanda, it was very much upheld, in the sense, I will talk about it later. It was a concept which talked about selflessness in your relationship with one another. It talks about issues of brotherliness, issues of neighborliness, and so the Rwandese, from all social backgrounds, they were supposed to uphold this particular principle of Umu Rwanda, and it's something that the present Rwandese administration is trying to inculcate into Rwandan society. But I say, beside all this, Rwanda was generally not a homogeneous society, in the sense that there were still groups that actually there were still groups within the various clan names. There were still various clans within the Rwandan society, which in a way could be interpreted, most people interpret it as different ethnic groups. Some of from my discussion with the people in Rwanda, I came up with this particular characterization, that the pre-colonial era in Rwanda was actually characterized by the supremacy of the kingship institution, the flexibility in class mobility, which I've actually mentioned earlier. And I think because of the issue of time, I will actually, some of these issues I've actually discussed. And again, before independence, there was a general change in colonial policy in Rwanda. One of the issues which the Belgians actually changed, because the Belgians actually took over Rwanda after the first World War. I think, because of time constraint, I won't be able to actually discuss on most of these the trends, the different the history of Rwanda from pre-colonial up to the post-colonial era. But safe to say that the Germans actually the Germans were defeated after the First World War, and the Belgians took over the tutelage of Rwanda. And one of the issues which they decided, was that though the Germans had actually put the Tutsis as the main, as the people to rule over Rwanda, the Hutus are actually people that actually have some leadership qualities in them. So they started empowering the Hutus. And by the early 1950s, the Tutsis had actually been empowered to such a way that they've actually been holding, important positions within the colonial administration, and the reason why this particular policy was being implemented was the democratic and self-determination doctrine that was being propagated after the Second World War. We talk about the Potsdam doctrine that talk about all colonial countries, or all people, all colonized people should actually be given the opportunity for self-government, and the fact that liberal clergymen were actually appointed to actually come and work in Rwanda at that late stage of the colonial rule. And the fact was that most of the people that were brought to Rwanda, were actually from French part of Belgium, and the French part in Belgium was one of that area in Belgium that had actually, were being suppressed by the Flemish and the German part. So they are coming from a point where they are being suppressed. So they come to Rwanda, then they realize that there's no way, or there is no need for them to actually suppress this majority people in Rwanda. So they some sort of change the policy with regards to their relationship with the colonized people. I also argue here that one of the reasons why this colonial policy actually changed was the assertiveness of King Rwanda. King Rwanda was a very charismatic leader. He took over the reign of Rwanda in 1932 after his father Musinga was dethroned and exiled to Congo, Belgium. And he took over, and because of his assertiveness, this is his house, because of his assertiveness, because of the way in which he interacted with the white person, with the colonial area, with the colonialist, he was actually, from the discussion I had, he was actually sterilized, so he never had kids. And his wife as well was also sterilized because they also didn't want his wife to also have, to probably have, to bring a hair somewhere from outside. And eventually he was killed in 1959. He was killed in 1959 in Bujumbura, which was then still part of Rwanda. So those are some of the, and I also argue here that one of the reasons why Rwanda was killed was because he actually demanded for independence, immediate independence for Rwanda, and the Belgians were not ready for to hand over this particular territory to the local political elite. And if they were ready to do that, they preferred the Hutus actually to the Tutsis. So there was a concerted effort by the colonial administration to actually empower the Hutus to actually, so that by the time the Belgians actually decide to leave Rwanda, they should be able to rule. And I in the next slide I argue here that one of the impact of this colonial change was the denunciation of the colonial administration by the king. The king actually denounced the colonial administration by writing a long letter to the United Nations in New York, which was entitled Mise au Point. The Hutu response by the famous Hutu Manifesto. There was also the organization of the decolonization process. The various political parties were being formed along ethnic lines. There was also the social revolution of 1959. There was a refugee crisis after the social revolution, which the Tutsis were killed. A majority of them left Rwanda and settled in the eastern Congo and in and mostly in Rwanda, in Uganda. There was the Inyenzi attack, because after this particular revolution, the Tutsis decided to come back to Rwanda through a guerrilla movement, which was aptly called the Inyenzi movement. There was also a deep hatred because of the fact that the Tutsis decided to come to Rwanda through this guerrilla warfare. There was this entrenchment of hatred, between the two groups. And I argue here again that because of this issue, there was a genocide. Because I really don't want to go into the genocide to talk about, because I know most of us actually understand what, how the genocide happened, most of it. But safe to say that, the main issue here was the fact that the Kayibanda administration, which was the first president, and the Habyarimana administration actually refused the Tutsi, refugees in neighboring countries to actually return to Rwanda. And the only way they could come to Rwanda was through an armed struggle. And that is the reason why the Rwandan Patriotic Front was formed. And then some of the reason why, the Rwandan Patriotic Front decided to invade Rwanda was first and foremost the indigenization policy in Uganda, where there was this policy where if you are not a born Rwandese, you wouldn't be able to hold particular, administrative positions in Rwanda and in Uganda. And at that time, there were, almost 2-3 million ethnic Tutsis in Uganda, and there was no way in which they could actually climb the political ladder in Uganda, because they were not being recognized in Uganda as Ugandans. So they had no option but to come to Rwanda through the invasion of 1990, which eventually led to the killing of over 800,000 people. Mostly, almost 80% were Tutsis. And how has the Rwandan government actually, negotiated itself out of this particular quagmire? One of the main policy direction which they have actually come up with is the liberal peace building model. And I argue here that this model was actually formulated by the first African UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali in the early 1990s, when he argued that liberal peace model should be that particular, transitional government, transitional initiative that takes into consideration people's needs on the ground. And one of the cornerstones of the liberal peace model approach is the balancing act between the patrimonial post-colonial state and the liberal values which one will want to talk about: the free movement, free association, and free ownership of properties by both men and women. And the main focus is on the role of international peace builders. How can the international community contribute in building that particular society? And I think, that is what the Rwandan government has actually been putting on the table. How can the international community help the Rwandese to actually build, the post-colonial state, the post-genocide state? And I think what the Rwandan government has actually, been doing is to make sure that most of these international actors actually work with local NGOs in order to make sure that whatever initiative that is being implemented in Rwanda is actually locally inspired, locally driven, and that the international NGOs should only be helping, in that regard. Another important, concept which is very much, the in thing in Rwanda is the Rwanda concept, which is the Rwandanness. How can, the post-colonial or the post-conflict state in Rwanda actually, come up with a policy or with a project that actually talks to all Rwandese, something that Rwandese will actually relate to. And from my discussion in Rwanda, they argue that it's not all about revisionism. It's not all about going to the pre-colonial era. It's all about promoting the concept of selflessness, the concept of friendliness, the concept of helpfulness. It talks about the issue of empowerment, the issue of unity, the issue of solidarity. So those are issues which the present administration is actually, trying to impact on the people, so that whatever thing they do, it should be able to have most of these particular values, and in mitigating this particular liberal society. What are the issues? What are some of the issues which the government has actually put in place? I argue here that the government of Rwanda actually, even after the post-1994, genocide, they actually committed to the Arusha Accord of 1993 by implementing the broad-based transitional government, which actually was aimed at, making sure that any any government after the genocide or should be able to talk to the various social groups in Rwanda. And one of the main issues which they did was to appoint Pastor Bizimungu, who was a Hutu, as president of the transitional government. And he ruled Rwanda for over 6 years, and he actually retired in 2000. And one of the issues which they also did was the reorganization of the state machinery. They embarked on an aggressive pro-market economic policy, a strict monetary policy to cope inflation. They resettle refugees from neighboring countries. They also promote the issue of morality in the management of state affairs, and they also break away from the Franc-Afrique, the French relationship that they had with Rwanda, and join the Commonwealth, which was very, very uncommon. And one of the main issues which they also did, which they are actually doing now, is reforming the security sector. I argue here that the Rwandan army is a well-disciplined and trained army. The police force is a very dedicated force. If you in Rwanda, you can actually walk at in the night 2-3 a.m. without being harassed by even thieves in Rwanda. The police force is very dedicated. You can actually ask a police to actually accompany you to a pub if you really want to. So that is how the country is really being managed. The police it's very much a people's police. There's also what we call the reorganization of the traditional society in Rwanda. One of the first things that the post-genocide administration did was to institute the Gacaca courts, in order to try the genocide perpetrators. And what they also did was to introduce the one poor family, one cow project, which was something that was actually being practiced in the pre-colonial area. So this is what the government is trying to make sure that, there's no poor family in Rwanda, in the sense that, in the Rwandan countryside, if you do have a cow, you are being considered rich. So that is what the government is trying to do. There's also, the government is also providing legal aid to citizens that cannot actually afford, because most of the, Rwandan citizens are actually accused of actually, either participating in the genocide or actually abetted the genocide. So most of these people actually didn't have the necessary resources to actually afford a lawyer. So the government is actually providing legal aid to some of these citizens. There's also the move towards a service economy. Rwanda has actually improved its infrastructure network, IT infrastructure. The road network has actually been improved. It has also improved its ties with developing countries, especially South America and China. Increased foreign reserve to boost trade, join progressive multilateral organizations such as the COMESA, the East Africa Community, the Nile Basin Initiative, and the Great Lakes Countries Initiative as well. It has also strengthened, and stabilized the Rwandan franc, liberalized the foreign exchange. Recently, they have actually agreed to join the East Africa Monetary Union, which will be a form of a monetary union between all the 7 countries of the East Africa Community that will actually create a single currency that will be used in all these countries. There's also the issue of strengthening, social cohesion and gender empowerment. Rwanda is one of those countries where there's about 63%. Presently, there's 63% of women in parliament in Rwanda. I think that's the highest you can find anywhere in the world. And there's also the issue of actually providing for representation of the Twa community in all the elective offices in Rwanda, and that has actually helped the people or the Twa community to actually feel belong in the new Rwandan society. Because of time, I will just move forward. And what are the challenges? What are the challenges challenges to these policies that the post-genocide government is actually putting in place. I argue in this map, I look at the extent of the Rwanda speakers. There are a lot of Rwanda is a very small country, not more than the size of Gauteng province, and there are almost like 10 million people in Rwanda, which is about 600 to 700 people per square kilometer. So the Rwandan they wouldn't be able, if everybody of Rwandan descent should be able to go back to Rwanda, they wouldn't be able to fit in this small country. And I argue here that the challenge for Rwanda at this particular moment is how the Rwanda relates to its diaspora. Because as I look from this map, you will realize that there is a huge chunk of Rwanda speakers in Uganda and in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which is all about the issue of the M23. The main thrust of the Rwanda supporting the M23 is because they actually want the M23 to protect the Rwanda speakers in Eastern Congo. I think this is something which is very important and which is actually at the foundation of the post-genocide state in Rwanda, the protection of Rwanda speakers in Eastern DRC, and that is a major challenge for the present administration. I also argue here that the issue of the unresolved problem of ethnicity in Rwanda is a major challenge, because the fact is, in the Rwandan constitution, there is what we call you are not supposed to refer to somebody as coming from a Tutsi, a Hutu, or a Twa. But the major challenge here is that this is a historical reality which the Rwandese people will definitely have to deal with it, and the fact is, talking to all these people, to all the people in Rwanda, the Rwandese government need to recognize the fact that, that Rwanda is actually made up of these three groups, these three social groups, and they should harness the differences from these three groups to be more of a uniting factor in the whole process of peace building in the country. There's also the issue of the issue of even the Tutsis bickering between themselves. We all understand that there was one Rwandan general who was actually that was almost killed here in South Africa, and the issue and the fact is he was one of the main commanders of the Rwandan Patriotic Front when they left Uganda to invade, Rwanda. But he has actually fallen out with the present administration in Rwanda. So they are actually, within the Tutsi themselves, they are not united. Secondly, from my discussion as well, the Tutsis from Rwanda, the Tutsis from the Eastern DRC, and those from Uganda, they actually don't see eye to eye. There is a kind of animosity between the two. So I think the present administration needs to look at some of those differences and make sure that, that whatever difference they do have, they should act as more like a uniting factor, more like a divisive one. The issue of the total liberalization of the political space. One thing which one has noticed in Rwanda is that, the political space is actually not liberalized. The moment you voice a contrary opinion to what the present administration is actually preaching, you are being called a genocide supporter and so on and so forth. So these are the challenges that I've actually mentioned. And one of the great things, one of the main issue, which I think is also very important, is the fact that the Hutus in Rwanda were actually being called to collectively apologize for the crimes that were committed in 1994. And for me, I think that was a major, setback with the present administration, because not all the Hutus actually committed, acts of genocide. There were, we've all watched Hotel Rwanda, where it was a Hutu that actually saved thousands and thousands of Tutsis during the genocide. I also encountered a Hutu who actually told me how he saved about 3,000 Tutsis. So it's not all Hutus that needs to be put in the same pot as being genocide perpetrators. That there should be a kind of a way in which the present administration should actually probably call a national conference to talk about the differences and to craft a way in which the present administration should actually move forward. Because if it is not done, it is but obvious that there is another genocide. Because talking to Hutus, they are very bitter about the present administration. And if they are not being accommodated within the present dispensation, it is but obvious that it's another genocide that is being prepared. It might not happen tomorrow, but 20, 30 years down the line, it's definitely going to happen. Thank you very much.